women's question in contemporary India, movements and legislations in post-independence India. That's the topic of our discussion today. We all know that there are several changes, notable changes, and different aspects of legal, political, and educational and social factors of women in post-independent India. But before going into the detail of the post-Indian scenario, we must have a prelude of pre-independence India, and we may start from the early 19th century when the women's question was a focused issue of social reform. I think since 1820s, you all know the contributions of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Keshav Chandra Sen, and even in the north and south India, there are different persons like Swami Dayanand Saraswati, a founder of the Arya Samaj, and Khwaja Altaf Hossain Hali. And in South India, R. Venkataraman Naidu, they all opposed the kind of a social oppression on the women. I think this is the beginning of asking some crucial and pertinent questions about the women being suppressed by social and different social customs. Then in Western India, M.G. Ranade, Behramji Malabari, Nodukesar Karve, D.K. Karve, all those people were the front runners in social reform regarding the women. This is the beginning in the 1820s from which we may start. As Geraldine Forbes' textbook, Women in Modern India, tells us that in the 19th century, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, we saw the emergence of quote-unquote new women who crossed the demarcations drawn by the traditional society for them. One of the brightest examples of these kind of women emerging was Sarala Devi Chaudhurani and the Shauno Kumari Devi. They were, both of them were connected with the great Tagore family. Particularly Sarala Devi was an educationist, a patriot, and a feminist. And they began to set a benchmark for the women who who craved for emancipation. There are others in other provinces of in India, Savitri Rao Phule, Begum Rokeya, Sister Subbalakshmi, Dr. Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, all these women, either the founders started schools or began to propagate reforms for the Indian women. Even in the 1940s, the Indian women, 30s, 40s, even in the 20s, I think, the Indian women began to join in the national movement. They were across ideology, Gandhian, socialist, arms movement, and the communist movement. They joined in the national struggle. There was consistent movement for women's rights, I think in 1930s. Particularly, the crucial issue was the female franchise and legal rights. However, it also should be noted that these groups who were fighting for these rights had often compromised with or settled for the less. The women were also active in trade union movements and peasant uprisings. There's a Tebaga movement where women were front runners. They were participated in the resistance movement in Tebaga. What I'm trying to argue is that the stage was set before independence. A stage was set for women to clamor and women to fight for their own rights. Now I'll come to the post-independence era. That the legacy of women's movement continued, and obviously in post-independence India there were new issues and challenges to deal with. The Indian Constitution declared equality a fundamental right. It guaranteed equal protection of the law, equal opportunities in public employment, and prohibited discrimination in public places. A huge gain was adult suffrage for women. This was one of the landmark thing. Now they also have equal say in electoral process, at least on paper. The political parties began to show their commitment to the women's issues. The women activists strongly backed Nehru's effort to enact Hindu Code Bill early 1950s. This enactment, by the way of enhancing legal rights to Hindu women, was a big step forward, particularly in view of the fact that its ultimate enactment defied stubborn oppositions from the conservatives. We know that even Dr. Rajendra Prasad was not in favor of this bill, and the rightist group like Jansangh also bitterly opposed this rule. But Nehru, with the help of the liberals, ultimately could sail through and enact this Hindu Code Bill. After independence, the women's movement visibly diversified. Many of the women who spearheaded this social reform and political activities in pre-independence time now became quote-unquote welfareist in their approach. This is a term I'm using, in their approach. The prominent women's organizations like All India Women's Conference, AIWC, were institutionalized. Several women leaders got themselves involved in government-initiated and other institutional activities for women's welfare. That included rehabilitation and recovery of women lost or abandoned as a result of mass migration and riots following the partition. I can give you statistics. Between 1947 and 57, 80,000 to 150,000 women were abducted. About 30,000 women were recovered by this period. And those who were recovered were afforded with working women's hostel in cities, women's vocational centers, daycare centers, and medical dispensaries. This was the welfareist group who were trying to resort to welfare activities of the women who were the victim of the partition. However, not everyone was happy with this welfareist approach. There were groups who were not happy with this approach. They didn't want to limit themselves within these welfare works only. The communist women were the most vocal in expressing their dissatisfaction. In 1954, Vivala Faruqi and her fellow female comrades in CPI organized a conference to discuss different women's issues. Ultimately, they broke away from the AIWC and formed their new organization, National Federation of Indian Women, or NFIW. The federation's declared aim was to emphasize on the women's struggle for equal rights and responsibilities in all spheres of life, and particularly improving the living conditions. Even those women who followed the Gandhian ideology, like Krishnabai Nimkar, gave priority to economic and social change. The point is that the welfareist approach now giving way to the struggles for improving living condition of the women and other and for the equal rights. However, in 1960s, still the Indian women, early 1960s, Indian women were still seeking for a united platform to fight for their cause beyond the party line. Till date, these organizations were working within the precinct of the party line. In the early 1960s, they were still seeking a broad, united platform to fight for their own cause. Next, in 1960s and 70s, we all know that the Indian political scenario went through a very tumultuous phase. And these political phase also had effects on women's movement. Uh, Particularly, the Naxalite movement emerging out of West Bengal attracted several women to their folds. And so did the Chipko movement, the anti-price movement, and Jayaprakash Narayan's Navnirman movement. These movements attracted the women. The anti-price movement in Maharashtra, spearheaded by the communist and socialist women, attracted housewives who came out of their house to protest against the price rise. This kind of a mass participation definitely has a liberating effect and effect on the women, and they wanted to gain a self-confidence and a space for their own. I think what I should argue that they were ready to face more complex issues such as imposition of patriarchy and opposition on women. There was another very significant development in 1960. That was the foundation of SEWA, SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association, led by Ila Bhatt, emerged as a very important self-help group. You can find in different cities of India still SEWA is helping out women to stand on their own feet, particularly I think in handicrafts sector. They are very active. In early 1960s in Uttarakhand, under the influence of Binoba Bhave, Sundarlal Bahuguna, an anti-liquor movement was organized. Similar but militant movement developed in Shahadar tribal area of Dhulia district in Maharashtra in 1972. The movement began as a movement for drought relief. It changed hands from the Gandhian Sarvodaya workers to the Maoists, and the prominent participants of this movement were the Bhil tribal women who saw the liquor dens as the major cause of wife beating. So they began to vandalize those dens and bring those offender husbands in public and punish them. Still, these anti-liquor movements are by fits and starts. We find it in existence across India. And the one very significant movement in which women played a leading role was the Chipko movement in Uttarakhand. In 1974, women were in the forefront. They were the persons who hugged those trees and tried to stop those trees being cut down by the timber contractors. They were the forefront of the movement, and this is one very significant aspect of this women participation in this movement, that this women's concern for the environment. And we know that the women are the greatest sufferer of environment degradation. If there is water shortage, they had to walk miles after mile to bring water. And if there is shortage of firewood, they had to walk about miles after mile to carry those firewoods. So their concern for the environmental degradation showed in Chipko movement. In late 1970s, two outstanding women's movement took place. In 1977 in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, the Mahila Mukti Morcha, the tribal movement, and under Jayaprakash influence, 1979, the agricultural laborers rose up against the temple priests of Bodh Gaya. And in the second movement, what is very significant, we must note that these women were fighting along with the NGOs and women groups. They ultimately succeeded in placing their own name in the registered copies of land deeds. That was something was never heard of in Bihar. In 1980s in Bhopal, after the Bhopal tragedy, Bhopal Gas Spirit Udyog Sangathan was very active. Maharashtra, the Samagra Mahila Agahari fought for the peasants' cause. And another important aspect of women's movement in India since mid-70s, in this 70s, 80s were the golden period for women's movement in India. And it has been argued by the different scholars. There were autonomous women groups in urban areas, in Hyderabad, in Mumbai, and particularly in 1975 when WIMO declared 1975 as the Women's Year, International Women's Year. That provoked and that encouraged the women's organizations to fight, to make their fight more sharper. There were a generation of scholar activists who started different organizations, Stri Shanghas, Sachetana, Bhimachona, and particularly one is very significant is Manushi, led by Madhur Kishwar. And political parties like Janata Party, they under their aegis, Mahila Dakshata Samiti played a major role in launching campaigns against dowry in a big way. And the dowry, the Dowry Prohibition Act came up in 1960. Along with dowry, another major issue which was affecting women was rape. And in late 1970s and early 1980s, there were some landmark cases in this regard, like Ramijabi case in Hyderabad, Mathura case in Maharashtra, Maya Tyagi case in Western UP. And women's group and organizations like Forum Against Rape raised huge protest and forced government in 1980 to bring a bill in parliament to amend existing law against rape. In 1983, the amended bill was passed, but this kind of solidarity unfortunately was not found when there was a Savanu case in 1986. The women's group, however, protested strongly against the Deorala Sati case in Rajasthan. Finally, we may conclude that the women's movement had come a long way since independence. However, they're suffering, the movement still suffering from lack of unity about goals, strategies, methods, and also sectarianism. But there are some bright spots also, or positive side also. These movements created a sort of a condition where government had to take some positive steps. A national perspective plan for women was drawn in 1988. When under this perspective, this plan, there was women's health, education, and political participation. These kind of things were taken into account. In 1993, the Panchayati Raj bill was passed, and 1/3 seats was reserved for women. Despite this, the Indian women still has a long way to go before they can fulfill their goal for the gender justice or gender equality. As we have already argued that there was a legacy of participation in social movements and national struggle by the women in India. And these groups created pressure after independence that their rights in family and as well as society must be safeguarded. Fortunately, our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was in favor of this kind of issues, and he struggled his way through to pass one of the landmark acts in regarding the women in early 1950s, between 1955 and 56, the Hindu Code Bill. The 4 acts were passed. The process began in 1951 but completed in 1955. These 4 acts, Hindu Marriage Act, Hindu Succession Act, Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, and Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act, these are huge service to the women's cause. From that time onwards, there were several acts were passed by Parliament regarding, say, like medical termination of Pregnancy Act, the MTP Act of 1971, Preconception and Prenatal Diagnostic Techniques Regulation Act, it was 1994, and women's rights and the labor laws, which were given big consideration. In 1976, the Equal Remuneration Act was passed. Discrimination in terms of remuneration was wiped off. The Maternity Benefits Act in 1961, amended in 2017. Protection of Women from Sexual Harassment Act at Workplace, Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act, 2013. And one very important act was passed in 1990, that is the National Commission for Women's Act. January 1992, the National Commission for Women, NCW, was formed. However, this body has no legislative power, and they had to depend on central or state governments for functioning. So there were some limitations. Still, they are raising women's causes or women's issues. The Special Marriage Act passed in 1954. The Indian Divorce Act passed in 1969. Prohibition of Child Marriage Act passed in 2006. Another controversial act was passed in 1986, the Muslim Women's Protection of Rights of Divorce Act, that's Shabanu, following the Shabanu case. The Criminal Law Amendment or Nirbhaya Act, that is in 2013. And in 2012, the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, or POCSO. These acts were some of the acts or major acts which were passed in the Parliament. Their declared aim is to safeguard the women's right in different aspects. But one should remember that notwithstanding these acts, still the women are not being fully given their rights or being protected from abuse. Still, there are some recourses for the women to or access to law for them to redress to some extent.